Could alien life look like life on Earth? And how well does Star Trek do in its coverage of genetics? Find out those answers and more in today's BioTrekkie Explains, starting now. Hello, my name is Mohamed Noor. I'm a biology professor at Duke University, and I'm an occasional science consultant for the Star Trek universe. I'm very excited today to do something a little bit different from what I usually do in these videos. So rather than taking a scene from an episode and breaking it down like I usually do, I'm going to briefly go over 3 questions that I very often get in conventions or interviews about science and Star Trek. And I'm going to do this a little bit more conversationally. I hope that's okay. I hope you like it. And let's get started. The first question is this: would we see life as we know it on other worlds? This is a big question. There's a couple of different ways to answer it, but let me stress up front, I'm not an astrobiologist, but also just a few astrobiologist friends if you're interested in following and getting some more information on this after my discussion. But back to the question, what might alien life look like? Well, first of all, alien life may have some aspects similar to life on Earth, but not necessarily. So here on Earth, our chemical constituents like carbohydrates and fats and proteins and DNA, they all have a carbon atom backbone, okay? And our chemical reactions use liquid water as a solvent. So both of these two pieces seem to make sense, at least here on Earth. So carbon is small, it's abundant in the universe, and it can bind to up to 4 other atoms. So it can make a lot of different kinds of chemical structures that other atoms can't make as easily. For example, it can make long chains like we see in carbohydrates. In terms of the solvents, again, water is made of 2 of the 3 most abundant elements in the universe, hydrogen and oxygen. It dissolves a lot of chemicals, it shows some polarity and charge, and it's liquid at temperatures and pressures on Earth. This last part is really important because these things seem to make sense on Earth, but there may be problems on other worlds. For example, on a world where, say, the average temperature is minus 50 Celsius, something like that, then something like liquid ammonia might make more sense as a solvent than water because it would actually be liquid at those temperatures. This is part of the challenge that we have. So when we think of what life should look like, we're kind of biased by the one place we've actually seen life. So how much of what we see here on Earth is necessary for life, and how much of it is just lucky? It's really hard to answer that definitively when our sample size of planets with known life is still 1. Now, if we see an alien that looks like a lot like a life form here on Earth, say like a Klingon, which looks a lot like a human, or a tree, or a mushroom on some other world, that's very unlikely to have evolved independently of life on Earth. And that's even true for something that has most of the properties of an Earth bacterium. The simplest explanation, if we see aliens that look just like life on Earth, is that they actually came from Earth. And this actually works very well with Star Trek canon. We heard in the original series about a species called the Preservers that took some Native Americans to some other planet. And we heard in Voyager about descendants of Earth hadrosaurs living on some other planet. Don't worry, I'm not going to dance. This isn't TikTok. But this sort of transplantation explanation is the best scientific explanation for aliens on other worlds that look just like life here on Earth, humanoid or otherwise. And in the real world, migration from Earth to other worlds probably has happened and will continue to happen with microbes. When we send landers to Mars or other places, it's very difficult to completely clean them of any spores that could possibly survive. Now, space agencies do try this as much as reasonable. NASA even has somebody called a planetary protection officer. This is currently Lisa Pratt. And they have 2 main responsibilities. The first is protecting the Earth in case of extraterrestrial involvement. That's a scary prospect. And second, making sure that Earth microbes don't travel and impact other planets. Anyway, I mentioned at the start of this video that I'm not an astrobiologist. An astrobiologist is someone who studies whether extraterrestrial life exists and how we might detect such life. NASA right now has a really big emphasis on astrobiology, and there's really, really great science research happening here. So here are 3 friends of mine who are excellent both in their astrobiology research and in their outreach. So feel free to pause this video and get their information to follow them on social media and learn about their work. I'll add their information to the credits as well. So moving on to the second question, how accurate are depictions of genetics in Star Trek? Well, let me preface by saying 2 things. First, it's called science fiction for a reason, and good fiction really does require creativity to go beyond the known world. And second, most of the Star Trek writers and staff are not professional biologists. Just like I'm not a theater professional and I have no idea what the gaffer or best boy or key grip do in productions, those are just words I see in the credits. That same thing is true for science fiction writers for science words. So with that in mind, I'd say Star Trek does a good job on some of the basics of genetics, and some of the places where genetics is slightly off reflect common misconceptions in science fiction and our society. So let me start by showing you this graph. It's easy to see the growth in genetics as a science across the various Star Trek series timing. So this graph shows the usage of the words DNA in red, genetic in blue, and genome in green across the 5 completed non-animated Star Trek series. So we look at the original series on the far left from the 1960s, there's almost no references to DNA or genetics, which makes sense because we hadn't even sequenced DNA yet at that point. As we go to the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine in the early 90s, we see a lot more references to genetics, which again makes sense. There's been a lot of growth in genetics research, a lot of progress in that. As we go into Voyager, the Human Genome Project is in full swing, and we see the word genome popping up fairly regularly there. As we go to Enterprise, the draft Human Genome is actually published, and we see a lot more references to DNA, genetics, and genomics. So overall, Star Trek does a really good job reflecting the genetics knowledge at the time. Now, Star Trek does pretty well with simple genetics terms and concepts. So as an example, B'Elanna Torres has she's half Klingon. She has a forehead with ridges that look like Klingon ridges. And those are called genetically dominant because she has one parent from a species with ridges and one parent from a species that does not have those ridges. So that's basically right. There are references in various Star Trek episodes to genes being hyperstimulated or dormant. Again, that's accurate. Genes produce products called RNA, and these guide the formation of proteins, and these genes can be turned on to higher levels, or hyperstimulated, or turned off or to lower levels, or made dormant. So again, pretty good. Next, across the various series, there are various genetic tests done for determining genetic ancestry, or relationships of individuals, or disease risk. Again, all pretty reasonable, and in fact, you could argue it's even slightly ahead of their time for when many of the series aired. I mean, today, of course, you can get a commercial genetic test that can easily tell you about how related you are to other individuals, assuming it's a fairly close relative, as well as getting some glimpse into your population ancestry. That was less true when those series aired, but they were ahead of their time. They got it right. Disease is a little bit trickier because most genetic diseases have multiple possible genetic causes and are influenced by the environment, but overall, pretty good. And when you get to the modern series like Star Trek Discovery, you hear references to advanced genetics concepts like recombination or mitochondrial DNA inheritance or horizontal gene transfer. I won't go into those here. I go into them in some of my other videos, but again, very impressive. And it may have happened in part because we also now have information much more readily available on the internet than we did back in, say, the late 80s and early 90s when some of the earlier series had run. Now, the place where Star Trek and honestly most science fiction gets things a bit off is in the context of mutations, and specifically how they seem in science fiction to be goal-oriented or synchronized across cells to make a new structure, or how they often cause changes over a few hours or days across the whole body. No. If someone suddenly got lots of mutations in cells throughout their body, it's way more likely that those would lead to cancer or death than growing a second heart or getting special powers or turning invisible or whatnot. Again, this is a pretty common misconception both in society and on TV, and this shows up especially in superhero shows. Even if Spider-Man got bitten by a radioactive spider, how did it change the DNA in basically all cells of his body and in the same coordinated way? No. This is the kind of thing that can be retconned with retroviruses or transposable elements or something like that, but it's at least not as simple as it's portrayed. But overall, Trek does pretty well on genetics as a whole, and the misconceptions that do show up are often ones that show up elsewhere in science fiction or in our society. Last question, this one's not so sciencey, is who's my favorite captain? Janeway. After all, she's a former science officer, and that shows in how she approaches problems and exploration, and she's just a great captain overall. I really admire her. Enough said. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for tuning into this unusual episode of BioTrekkie Explains. I'm not going to release a video next month because I have something different and quite special brewing. I'm hoping to launch here in January. I hope you enjoy it. Stay tuned, live long and prosper, and thank you for tuning in. Bye.